New York, late 1965, a windowless dressing room after the lights have gone down. The air still smells of sweat and hot cables. No applause left, just noise settling. A radio is playing. Forgotten, still warm. Bob Dylan's voice cuts through the static, calm, detached, almost bored. Elvis used to be dangerous. Now he's just polite. No one laughs. No one moves. That sentence isn't heard by a reporter. It isn't caught by a fan looking for drama. It lands in the same room as the man who broke American music before protest had a soundtrack. Elvis Presley doesn't react the way people expect. He doesn't flare up. He doesn't defend himself. He doesn't smile. He reaches out and turns the radio off. Then, quietly, so quietly it barely counts as speech, he says something only a few people will ever hear. A sentence that never reaches print. A thought that won't become a quote. Years later, that silence will matter more than any answer he could have given. This story doesn't begin with anger. It begins with restraint, and with a man deciding what kind of danger he's still willing to be. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. 1965 did not arrive loudly. It crept in through newspaper columns, radio panels, the tone people used when they said America is changing. By then, Bob Dylan was no longer the skinny prophet with an acoustic guitar. He had gone electric, abrasive, impatient. To a younger generation, he sounded like truth scraping its knuckles raw. To older ears, he sounded like trouble, and he welcomed that. Elvis Presley, meanwhile, was learning how quiet fame could be. The army was behind him. Hollywood contracts were stacked neatly in drawers. Scripts arrived, polished, harmless, profitable. His days were scheduled by men who spoke softly and never asked what he wanted to sing, only what would sell. He still filled rooms when he entered them, but the rooms felt smaller now, padded, safe. The press needed a story, and it found one easily. Dylan is honesty. Elvis is spectacle. Dylan risks everything. Elvis plays it safe. The comparisons spread without malice, but with precision. It wasn't gossip. It was classification. Then came the interview. Dylan, restless as always, was asked about heroes. About Elvis. He didn't smile. He didn't sneer either. He spoke the way people do when they believe the verdict has already been reached. Elvis, he said, used to be dangerous. Now he wasn't. Not a joke, not an insult, a diagnosis. The words traveled quickly. Someone read them aloud in a quiet room in California. Someone else waited for anger, for a reaction sharp enough to feed tomorrow's headline. Elvis didn't give them one. He sat back, hands folded, eyes lowered, not in defeat, but in calculation. No slamming doors, no curses. When a member of his team suggested pushing back, reminding the world who had come first, Elvis shook his head. No, he said. His voice was calm, almost tired. He's not wrong about the fear. That stopped the room. Then he added, softer, as if speaking only to himself, he's wrong about why it's gone. What none of them understood was that Elvis wasn't wounded. He was exhausted, tired of pretending danger was something you could schedule between lunch and wardrobe, tired of being brave only when permission was granted. Dylan was free to provoke because he had nothing to lose. Elvis had everything, and that, he knew, was the trap. Outside, the decade kept accelerating. Inside, Elvis remained still, aware that silence could be louder than defense. The era had drawn a line between two men who had never intended to stand opposed, and somewhere in that quiet, the first crack formed, not in public image, but in something deeper, more dangerous. Because Elvis wasn't angry. He was listening. Night at Graceland had a weight to it that daytime never carried. The halls looked longer after midnight, the lights dimmed just enough to turn familiar rooms into places where thoughts echoed. Elvis preferred it that way. Fewer eyes, fewer expectations, fewer reminders of who he was supposed to be. A small group sat with him that night. People who had known him before the costumes hardened, before every gesture carried a price tag. No assistants, no schedules pinned to the wall. Just low voices, clinking ice, the hum of the house settling. No one brought up Bob Dylan. Elvis did, not defensively, not with bitterness. He mentioned the name the way one mentions weather, something already passing through. "He sings like he's free," Elvis said, staring into his glass. "I sing like I owe something." The room went still. Someone tried to lighten it with a half smile, but Elvis didn't look up. He wasn't asking for reassurance. He was stating a fact he'd been circling for years. He spoke about control, not his power, but his leash. About how every risk now came with consequences far beyond bad reviews. He had seen what happened when the system felt threatened. Contracts tightened, doors closed quietly, opportunities vanished without explanation. "I'm not scared of losing my voice," he said. "I'm scared of losing everything else." That was the truth he rarely allowed himself to finish aloud. Danger to Elvis wasn't rebellion. It was unpredictability. And unpredictability meant other people stepped in to protect their investments. His name wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to rooms he'd never entered. "If I scare them again," he said, almost whispering now, "they'll take everything away." No one argued. They knew he wasn't exaggerating. Later, when the house had gone quiet, Elvis stayed awake. A record player turned slowly in the corner, needle lifting, dropping again. Dylan's voice filled the room, uneven, unapologetic, unconcerned with polish. Elvis listened the way musicians listen when no one is watching. Closely, critically, almost hungrily. He didn't try to imitate it. That wasn't the point. The songs sounded unfinished, dangerous in their refusal to please. Elvis replayed them, not for comfort, but for permission. Somewhere between the raw chords and fractured phrasing, he heard a version of himself he hadn't been allowed to be. The next day, he asked his musicians to strip things back, fewer layers, less shine. "Make it rough," he said, "like it might fall apart." They exchanged looks, unsure if he meant it. He did. This wasn't a comeback yet. It wasn't even rebellion. It was quieter than that, an internal shift, barely visible. But once it started, it didn't stop. Elvis didn't want to answer Dylan. He wanted to understand why the words had landed so close to the truth. By early 1968, the idea began circulating in the careful, indirect way the industry preferred. No one made formal calls. No contracts appeared. It was suggested in hallways, floated over drinks, framed as coincidence rather than intention. What if Elvis and Dylan met? It sounded harmless enough. Two icons, a photograph, a shared cigarette. Something symbolic that could be sold as unity in a fractured time. The country was already burning at the edges. Music, they thought, could soften the flames. When the question reached Elvis, he didn't answer right away. He listened, nodded once, and then declined. "If I meet him now," he said, "I'll explain myself." A pause. "I don't want to explain." It wasn't arrogance. It was instinct. He knew that any conversation would turn him into a defense case, a man justifying choices he hadn't fully made. Dylan lived comfortably inside contradiction. Elvis was still trying to escape it. Privately, something shifted. Dylan's words, spoken years earlier, carelessly, maybe even kindly, had found their target. Not the image, the center. Elvis understood now why they stung. They named a loss he'd been avoiding. Not danger, but agency. So, he stopped talking. Rehearsals began in a studio that felt too clean at first. Lights bright, floors polished. Elvis stood in the middle of it, uneasy, as if the room itself expected him to behave. He didn't. He asked for the decorations to be stripped back. No fake laughter, no scripted warmth. The black leather suit arrived quietly, no announcement, no committee discussion. He chose it because it felt wrong for television, tight, stark, uninviting. It wasn't nostalgia. It was refusal. During late rehearsals, he interrupted a run-through and shook his head. Christmas songs were mentioned, familiar hits, comfort. "No," he said. "If they're comfortable, we're doing it wrong." There was tension now. Real tension. Not anger, but risk, producers whispered. NBC executives worried about sponsors. This wasn't the Elvis they had ensured. Between takes, Elvis said little. When he did speak, it was precise. He wasn't trying to prove he was dangerous. He was trying to remove everything that made him harmless. Silence filled the spaces where jokes used to live. The musicians felt it too. That uneasy sense that something irreversible was approaching, not reinvention, exposure. Elvis never mentioned Dylan by name again. He didn't need to. Every decision was an answer that didn't rely on language. Every stripped chord, every unsmiling glance toward the camera carried weight. This wasn't preparation for a comeback. It was the stillness before impact, the moment when explanation gives way to action and the cost no longer matters. The tension was already there before a single camera officially rolled. You could feel it in the way people avoided eye contact, in the forced cheerfulness of production assistants pretending this was just another television event. It wasn't. Everyone in the studio knew it, even if no one dared say it out loud. Elvis stood under the lights, not yet performing, already resisting. The script lay nearby, pages marked with jokes that had tested well, transitions designed to reassure viewers that nothing unexpected would happen. He glanced at it once, then pushed it aside. When a producer gently reminded him of the planned opening, Elvis shook his head. "No warm-up," he said. "Let it sit." NBC executives exchanged looks. Silence on live television was dangerous. Uncertainty scared advertisers more than controversy ever had. When the musicians gathered for the sit-down sessions, the distance vanished. No stage, no separation, just bodies close enough to hear breathing change. Elvis sat forward, elbows on his knees, eyes alert. This wasn't nostalgia. It was confrontation with the songs, with himself. Someone whispered behind the monitors, "This is too raw, too close." No one answered. They started playing, no polish, no safety net. The sound wasn't perfect, and that was the point. Elvis didn't correct mistakes. He leaned into them. Sweat formed quickly under the lights, darkening the leather. His voice carried strain, not weakness, but effort. Every note felt earned. Midway through a take, between lines, he spoke without planning to. A sentence slipped out, quiet but unmistakable. "Singing pretty is easy," he said. "Singing true costs more." The room froze. A producer gestured frantically toward the control booth. That wasn't approved. That wasn't safe. For a moment it seemed certain the line would be cut, buried under edits. But something in the silence that followed made removal feel dishonest. Too many people had felt it. Musicians exchanged glances. They understood. This wasn't the Elvis they'd been hired to accompany. This was a man shedding layers in real time. "This isn't polite," one of them muttered later. Not as criticism, as warning. By the end of the session, everyone was unsettled. The footage didn't look like a comeback. It looked like defiance without slogans. Elvis hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't explained himself. He had simply stopped performing safety. Somewhere, years earlier, a younger man had said, "Elvis used to be dangerous." Watching the monitors now, no one felt the need to repeat it. When the broadcast finally aired, there was no immediate roar. No single headline captured it cleanly. The silence afterward felt deliberate, as if the country needed a moment to decide what it had just witnessed. Critics hesitated. Some reached for familiar language and came up empty. This wasn't nostalgia. It wasn't rebellion either. Older fans felt unsettled, unsure where the comforting version of Elvis had gone. Younger viewers didn't cheer. They leaned forward. Something had shifted, but it refused to announce itself. In one corner of the industry, the reaction was quieter and more telling. A musician who spent time around Dylan mentioned it in passing, almost reluctantly. Bob hadn't said much, but he hadn't expected that. Not the restraint, not the refusal to explain. The answer, if it was one, hadn't been spoken in a language Dylan usually answered. For the first time, the arrow curved back. Elvis didn't celebrate. There were no private victories, no satisfaction in proving anyone wrong. What mattered came later, in rooms where deals were discussed. Television executives wanted more specials, more structure, more versions of the same thing, now labeled authentic. Elvis listened, then he shook his head. I don't want safe rooms anymore. It wasn't defiance, it was boundary. They warned him gently. Live performance was unpredictable, exhausting, risky, the very things he'd been protected from. He understood that better than anyone in the room. That was why he agreed, not to repeat the past, but to step into uncertainty on purpose. The decision led him away from cameras and toward audiences that couldn't be edited, toward rooms where mistakes would linger, where presence mattered more than perfection. Las Vegas waited, but not the Vegas he'd known before. This would be stripped of glamour, heavy with expectation. Some advisors worried he was trading control for chaos. Elvis didn't argue. He had learned that control was its own kind of trap. At home later, alone, he replayed moments from the special in his head, not the applause, but the pauses. The seconds where nothing covered him, where he'd felt exposed and, strangely, steady. That was the answer, he realized. Not to Dylan, not to the press, to himself. The danger hadn't returned as spectacle. It had arrived as a choice, one he couldn't undo. And once made, it demanded to be followed through, no matter the cost. The first nights back in front of a live audience felt unfinished, almost exposed. There was no cinematic distance now, no lens to soften mistakes. The rooms were close, the air heavy with breath and expectation. When Elvis walked on stage, he didn't glide. He arrived. You could see the weight in his shoulders before he sang a note. The sound wasn't smooth, his voice frayed at the edges, sometimes dipping where it used to soar. Instead of hiding it, he let it sit in the open. People noticed. Some leaned back, confused. Others leaned in, sensing something fragile and unrepeatable happening in front of them. Backstage, after one of the early shows, Elvis wiped sweat from his face and looked at the band. I don't want them to love me, he said. I want them to feel something. No pep talk followed, no explanation. The musicians understood this meant fewer guarantees. Every night could go wrong. The response came anyway. And it wasn't unanimous. Parts of the intellectual crowd grew suspicious. Articles appeared questioning sincerity, suggesting this rawness might be another carefully timed phase. The accusation had changed shape, but it was familiar. Performance disguised as truth. Elvis read the pieces without comment. He wasn't surprised. Authenticity, he'd learned, made people nervous. It removed the comfort of categories. Then came the comparisons again. Dylan changes the world with words, one columnist wrote. Elvis does it with presence. Elvis folded the paper, set it down, and smiled. A small, private gesture. Not because he agreed, and not because he felt vindicated. The smile came from recognition. The tension he'd been carrying finally had a name. He wasn't trying to be a symbol anymore. Symbols survive by distance. He was choosing closeness, to the audience, to the moment, to the cost of being there without armor. Each show demanded something physical, something emotional. He gave it willingly, even as it drained him. The system adjusted quickly, as systems do. Offers arrived dressed as freedom, promising scale without sacrifice. Bigger rooms, better terms, less risk. The icon wanted to be preserved again. Elvis delayed his answers. He understood the paradox now. The more real he became, the harder they tried to freeze him into something manageable. The crown was always waiting, polished, ready to be placed back on his head, but he wasn't interested in wearing it. The danger hadn't disappeared. It had changed direction. And Elvis knew with quiet clarity that choosing not to be a symbol might be the riskiest act of all. By the early 70s, the rooms were full again, always full. Sold-out signs became routine, applause predictable in its force. From the outside, it looked like triumph refined. A man restored to his throne, commanding attention with ease. Inside, it felt nothing like that. Each performance demanded more than the last. Elvis no longer stepped into a role that carried him through the night. He stepped into himself, fully present, without distance. The effort showed. His breathing grew heavier between songs. He sat more often, not for effect, but because his body insisted. The honesty he had chosen did not fade when the lights went out. It stayed with him, pressing down. After one show, in a small, sterile room that smelled faintly of disinfectant, he spoke to a doctor who had learned to listen more than advise. "When I was fake," Elvis said, eyes closed, "it was easier. A pause, long enough to feel deliberate. When I'm honest, it hurts longer." The words weren't dramatic. They were clinical, observational, as if he were describing a condition rather than confessing pain. The press noticed the strain, too. For the first time, the tone shifted. A critic wrote that Dylan provoked thought, but Elvis absorbed pain, took it into himself, night after night. It wasn't accusation, it was concern. The article didn't ask whether Elvis was real anymore. It asked how long a person could do this and remain intact. Elvis read it slowly. He didn't bristle. He didn't argue. Something in the phrasing stayed with him. Later, in a quieter moment, he said to someone close, "I didn't come back to compete with ghosts." His voice carried no bitterness, only fatigue. He had never meant to be an answer, silent or otherwise. That role had found him without consent. The truth was heavier than any costume he'd worn. Being present meant being vulnerable in a way the stage didn't forgive. There was no filter, no irony to hide behind. The crowd felt everything. And so did he. Elvis understood now that danger didn't always look like rebellion. Sometimes it looked like endurance, like standing still while the weight accumulated. The applause still came. So did the exhaustion. And somewhere beneath the noise, a quiet realization settled in. The honesty he fought for was exacting its price, one night at a time. By the mid-70s, time no longer felt linear to Elvis. Years folded in on themselves. Old conversations resurfaced without warning, stripped of their original heat, leaving only meaning behind. One afternoon, almost casually, someone mentioned the comment again. The one from the 60s. It wasn't quoted sharply this time. No edge. Just recalled as a cultural footnote. Something people used to say when explaining how music had changed. Elvis didn't interrupt. He didn't tense. He nodded once. He said that because he was free, Elvis replied after a moment. "I was trying to become free." The distinction mattered to him now. Back then, he had felt named, exposed. Now, he heard the words differently, not as judgment, but as observation spoken by someone who had chosen distance over responsibility. There was, briefly, an opening. Not a meeting, not a headline. Something smaller. A suggestion that a message could be passed along. A line, perhaps. A mutual acknowledgement, quiet and adult. Elvis declined. "If I talk to him now," he said, almost apologetically, "it'll sound like an excuse." That was the risk he refused to take. Not pride, clarity. He had spent too long explaining himself to rooms that never intended to listen. He would not let his final words become justification. Later alone, he sat longer than usual, hands resting idly, gaze unfocused. The house was quiet. Not peaceful, quiet in the way places become when conversation has finally ended. "He didn't hurt me," Elvis said, barely above a whisper. "He named something I couldn't. There was no bitterness in it, only recognition. Dylan had spoken from the outside. Elvis had lived on the inside. Both had told the truth they were capable of telling. The distance between them remained, not as conflict, but as fact. Two men shaped by the same era, moving through it with opposite defenses. One survived by keeping space, the other by giving himself away. Elvis understood now why the conversation could never happen. Not because it was impossible, but because it was unnecessary. Everything that needed to be answered already had been, just not out loud. The sentence survived longer than either man expected. Elvis used to be dangerous. It floated through retrospectives, liner notes, late-night conversations between people trying to understand what had happened to the music and to themselves. Over time, the words lost their sharpness. They became shorthand, convenient, almost harmless. But the meaning had never been that simple. Danger, as the decade aged, was often mistaken for volume or rebellion, for spectacle, for youth. Elvis had once embodied all of that, and then stepped away, not because it vanished, but because it changed direction. He was never dangerous to the system in the way people imagined. The system learned how to absorb him quickly. He wasn't dangerous to music either. Music survived everyone. The danger was internal. Elvis became most threatening when he stopped protecting himself, when he chose closeness over distance, presence over irony, when he allowed the weight of every room, every expectation, every night to pass directly through him without armor. That kind of honesty had a cost. Dylan survived by standing back, shaping ideas, letting words travel where he did not. Elvis moved forward, absorbing the impact himself. Two strategies, two truths, neither clean, neither free. There was no victory in the comparison, only consequence. In the end, Elvis never answered Bob Dylan, not because he lacked words, but because words were never the point. The response lived in choices, in nights where his voice cracked and he didn't retreat, in moments where he refused safety even when it would have saved him. He didn't want to be right. He wanted to be real. And that, finally, was the danger no one could manage. Not the industry, not the audience, not even Elvis himself. The story doesn't close with a revelation or a verdict. It ends the way it always had for him. Quietly, after the sound fades, leaving only what was felt behind. No explanation, no defense, just silence and the weight of it.